Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, a number of days ago, just 2 days ago, in fact, the U.S. envoy to Special Representative for Iran, Brian Hook, wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that the U.S. is ready to snap back or use the snapback mechanism within the JCPOA to have sanctions, UN sanctions, brought back onto Iran. All of this is because the United States is concerned about the arms embargo that is set to expire very soon. It wants that to be extended. The Europeans have spoken about possibly having a new arms embargo of sorts negotiated with Iran and brought to the fore against the country at this time. But the U.S. has gone as far as saying it would want that snapback mechanism if the arms embargo is vetoed by the likes of the Russians and the Chinese. Even within the U.S., though, now there are voices that are saying that that talk of snapback, at the very least, is not a good idea. Because Iran has already threatened that it may very well walk away from the NPT. Now, we don't know if that is an empty promise or a legitimate promise on the part of Iran, because that sort of thing has been promised in the past as well at various times by the Iranians. However, just the threat of it is important enough. And secondly, what would it really gain? Would it really ensure that people around the world respect, A, the UN sanctions, and B, the arms embargo on Iran? It's not like Iran has the capability to be able to buy really expensive weapons anyways. So what really is the U.S. gaining from all of this at this time, apart from just possibly wanting the nuclear deal to fall apart altogether, which may very well be the goal going into these elections in November, especially if Trump thinks that Biden may win. He essentially will give Biden a situation where Biden won't be able to even walk back into the nuclear deal if he so wins again in November this year. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined by Reza Khanzadeh, who is a research fellow at the Sharif University think tank and is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us from London is Farhang Jahanpour, who is a part-time tutor at the Department of Continuing Education at Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. Farhang and Reza, thank you both for your time today. Farhang, let me start with you. What do you make of Brian Hook's article, essentially, and the U.S. demand that the arms embargo be extended on Iran?
Well, it's very, very strange, but we have got used to some very strange happenings in Washington. As you know, May last year, the United States violated the deal which the previous U.S. administration had reached, not only with Iran, but with all the international community, as well as the Security Council 2231, which supported it, unilaterally withdrew. But that was not all. It even introduced some very severe sanctions on Iran, which President Trump some time ago said has been the most severe imposed on any country ever. And not only did the U.S. impose those sanctions, it has even forced other countries not to trade with Iran because of U.S. dollar being the international currency. But now, after all that, they have not achieved anything which they wanted, because they said, as a result of the maximum pressure, they will bring Iran to its knees. It hasn't brought to its knees. And so now they are trying to go back to this completely nonsensical idea of America's snapback, because not only it violated the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, it also imposed sanctions contrary to the Security Council resolution. So they are neither members of the Security Council resolution 2231 nor of the JCPOA. The Russian envoy at the UN called it delusional, and even just yesterday the Chinese envoy called it stupid. And even the European allies are very suspicious about these moves. So yes, these are some very strange things which we have got used to and probably will continue to the end of the current administration.
Reza, I wonder why it is that the arms embargo is so important for the Iranians. Because as I said in my intro, it's not like the Iranians right now, at the very least, have the capability to buy really expensive weapons, right? So, I mean, you know, the economy, as we can all agree, is not doing very well in the current situation. So why is this important for Iran to have this arms embargo lifted?
Right. I feel that the importance here has more to do with a symbolic and foreign policy, and also a domestic policy type of presentation, if you will. Because as you noted earlier in the program, the types of arms, the type of weapons that Iran would like to get its hands on are too expensive. And even though the countries like Russia have been vocal on wanting this to be lifted so they can sell arms to Iran. Currently, most recently, Russia has been showing signs of kind of, dragging its feet, if you will, when it comes to selling Iran certain types of weapons, or even, denying Iran certain types of weapons. So for Iran, it is more of, I believe, a symbolic gesture that that the U.S. can't do whatever it wants. I do agree with Dr. Jahanpour that the U.S. walking away from the JCPOA and then wanting to come back and have these snapback, mechanisms into place. It is very, silly or stupid, as it's been, noted. But it's also for Tehran to show that we've been right all along when it comes to negotiating with Washington, or particularly with Trump. That you can't do it. You can't trust them. This is the way they do business. This is the way they deal with other types of, deals and treaties and countries. And we were right, they were wrong. And, going to the point also about Biden, him having more struggles as far as trying to bring the U.S. back into this deal. I think the question more should be asked: Will Tehran, or more specifically, will the supreme leader of Iran want to have such a scenario play out where there is a possibility of the U.S. coming back to the JCPOA? I doubt to see Iran wanting that to happen would actually show a sign of weakness on their part.
All right, so Farhang, if we talk about the worst case scenario, right? Because when it comes to the snapback mechanism, right, with the arms embargo, we know that the Russians and the Chinese can veto that. But it seems when it comes to the snapback mechanism as understood within the Security Council Resolution 2231, seemingly the argument is being made on the part of U.S. officials and is being understood by many legal experts who have read that in great detail, that the U.S. is still in some odd way possibly an original party to that resolution, and so can still hold some sway in the regard of snapback mechanism. And the snapback mechanism is also odd because it cannot be vetoed. It defies logic in some ways why that was even agreed upon by the Iranians. But considering it was, do you think that may very well happen? Like, do you think there's a very realistic possibility of that happening? And then how would the Iranians react? Because the Iranians have said, if that happens, we'll walk away from the NPT, for example.
Well, you said that Iranians have threatened many times in the past to do certain things, but they have not carried them out. I think we should not really count on that, because on a number of issues, they have actually done exactly what they said. For example, after the U.S. attack and assassination of General Soleimani, they did attack U.S. bases. Earlier on, they did bring down a U.S. drone on Iranian territory, and so on. And so I think if it goes that far, it will make the situation much, much more dangerous for everybody. I advise very strongly that Iranians should really abide within the JCPOA and convince the European powers to also abide by it, as they are saying that they would like to do. But as I said, it really has nothing to do with law. You mentioned a few lawyers who have said that America somehow magically has the power to do this. These are very partisan lawyers. International lawyers believe that America has no legs whatsoever, either legal or moral legs to stand on, because it violated the deal. It cannot go back. If they want to go back to the Resolution 2231, they say they are members of it, they should lift the sanctions first and then talk about the other issues. I think a very important issue that we must bear in mind is that, as Mr. Khanzadeh said, of course, it has partly to play with Iran's domestic issues, because they also have a domestic politics. But it also has a lot to do with American domestic politics. I think on the combination of a large number of disappointments by President Trump, and now, of course, being caught with the virus, he really wants to have a way out. So to my mind, there are two major issues behind all this nonsense and all this talk. One is the domestic issue before going to the next election in November. And the second thing is to divert attention from Israel's annexation of more Palestinian territory and, in fact, its nuclear program. The only country in the Middle East which has nuclear weapons is not Iran, it is Israel. Yeah. So to try to divert attention from that and also from the annexation of more Palestinian lands, I think is what is behind this.
All right, Reza, I'll give you the final word, I'll let you both go. What do you think the coming days hold? Because there's a lot of, pessimistic, fatalistic talk about how Donald Trump and his team just want this deal to collapse before November's elections, and then that would work very well with their voter base. Is that actually likely to happen, do you think?
Well, the likelihood of that happening, I believe, is somewhat high. But that's to take into consideration a vast number of variables, both foreign and domestic, and just more specifically, the Trump administration's very poorly job handling of the COVID virus within its borders. But then also its face value as far as its foreign affairs as well. Trump canceling the funding to the HWO, for example, and things of that nature kind of point into a direction of where him wanting to completely dismantle or destroy or things of that nature of the JCPOA.
Yeah.
I feel it just leads the U.S. down a path where trying to return into a more, diplomatic stance with the entire, world community would be more difficult for future presidents.
Okay, we'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate Reza and Farhang for their time and, of course, their expertise. When it comes to this, the arms embargo A and then the snapback mechanism B as options for the U.S. to continue its pressure campaign on Iran, it's interesting to note how this may all play out, because it seems we're coming now into the final laps of what exactly will happen to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Are these the final breaths of that deal altogether? Will the U.S. be able to force the hand of all the other signatories, in a sense, to just making this deal collapse altogether, especially if the worst-case scenario of the snapback mechanism comes into play? Will the Russians, the Chinese, or the others, even the Europeans, be able to save the deal in some way? Iran has been asking all of the above, especially the Europeans, to do more to ensure that the country continues to, or has at least, any of the benefits that it was promised under this deal. That has not yet worked out very well for the Iranians. And as I said, when you read the details of the snapback mechanism, I could be wrong, of course, but it seems that within that, the snapback mechanism cannot be vetoed if that is brought to the fore, although there are some complex legal issues and clauses within that which are to be discussed and should be discussed openly, and are at this point in time being discussed by many legal experts, especially online. I'll leave it there for that. I'll be back with my next segment after. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Venezuela and Iran. Iran has sent out a number of oil tankers out into the sea. At least one of them, for sure, is headed for Venezuela. The others, around 4 of them, their destinations are not 100% known at this point in time, as they have not yet announced their destinations. However, the fear on the part of the U.S. is that those tankers are heading for Venezuela. Now, it's not 100% sure that all of the above are carrying just oil, and that also is what the U.S. fears, and that they may be carrying other sorts of supplies that are unknown at this point in time. Now, on top of this, a number of days earlier, we also had Pompeo, who had spoken about Iran's Mahan Air and had said that he had wanted countries that provide overflight or allow for overflights of Mahan Air flights to Venezuela to not allow for Mahan Air to fly over their airspace, because his fear was that, again, Mahan Air was supplying things to the Venezuelan government, of Maduro specifically I'm speaking about, that may be untoward and something undesirable on the part of the U.S. Now, what Iran says and Venezuela say seemingly is that the Mahan Air has been supplying things for a refinery in Venezuela so that Venezuela is able to have that up and operating to at least a certain extent, because we know Venezuela has been, essentially, its oil industry has been decimated because of the sanctions and otherwise at this point in time, even though it is a very oil-rich country. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Alex Crowther, who is a research professor at Florida International University. He's a former research professor at Strategic Studies Institute and the U.S. National Defense University. He has 15 years of experience on the ground in Latin America, and he's joining us now from Miami. Alex, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us. What do you make of what may very well happen on the high seas? Are we almost setting up for a clash between the Iranians and Americans because of the Iranian and Venezuelan friendship?
Well, thank you for asking me to participate this morning. You know, this has been going on for a long time. Iran has been under sanctions from the United Nations and the OECD and the European Union and the United States for years, going as far back as 1979. Venezuela is under sanctions by the European Union and the United States for political hijinks, really, on the part of Maduro. I would say that nobody really fears that these ships are going to be going to Iran, from Iran to Venezuela with oil, because, you know, 4 ships worth of oil isn't really going to help Venezuela very well. The Iranians and the Venezuelans have had a common cause for quite a while. There have been several times a week, every week, flights between Tehran and Venezuela. The Venezuelans have given a big chunk of Margarita Island to the Iranians, and so this is really nothing new. What's new is the ratcheted up sanctions against both Iran and Venezuela. For instance, the Financial Action Task Force put Iran on the bad boy list in February, and the United States has imposed additional sanctions as well.
What is the goal here then? Because these are 2 countries, as you said, who have common cause at this point in time. They're both under U.S. sanctions at the very least. Can the U.S. police them to the extent where it prevents them from having these sorts of relations where Iran is supplying things to Venezuela to at least get its oil infrastructure, i.e. its badly decimated refineries, up and running to an extent?
Well, even the Iranians can't help the Venezuelans put their oil infrastructure back together. PDVSA, the national oil company of Venezuela, has been racked by mismanagement during both the Chavez and Maduro regimes. And so, you know, even the Iranian oil system isn't doing that well because of sanctions. They need parts, they need technology. And so really it's a common cause type thing, much like the North Koreans and the Iranians share missile technology.
So then if it's, if I may use the term, unimportant, then why is the U.S. So concerned about this at this time?
I mean, this is part of an attempt to do behavior modification against both the Iranians and the Venezuelans. Both regimes have been accused of supporting terrorism. The Venezuelans have been accused of smuggling drugs. They're both doing anti-democratic actions at home, suppressing the people, and so this is part of a full court press, non-violent, to try to get them to change their ways. Nobody wants to go violent on any of this stuff. So what's happening is the United States is looking at how to make the sanctions more effective and what additional sanctions could be put on in order to try to get them to change their behavior.
All right, let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Jesus Rodriguez-Espinoza, who's a founder and editor at OrinocoTribune.com, and he's also a former Venezuelan consul general who is in Chicago. He's joining us now from Caracas. Jesus, thank you for your time this morning. What do you make of the Iranian shipments to Venezuela, and even those flights between Iran and Venezuela, where Iran seemingly is sending supplies to Venezuela for it to try to revive its refinery?
Yes, what I make is like any country have the right to find ways to solve with sovereignty its problems. So disregarding that the Iranian government have somehow not accept the claims about ships, tankers coming with gasoline to Venezuela. Disregarding that, the most important thing is that we are talking about two sovereign nations that have problems in their population. I mean, Venezuela has been affected heavily for the last, 8 weeks with gasoline scarcity due to U.S. sanctions that have affected our oil industry for several years already. And we have the right to find ways to solve the problems that are affecting our population. It's an aberration that the U.S., with these crazy illegal actions, illegal sanctions, is able to chase like a mouse and cat and mouse any shipments, any attempt that Venezuelan government responsibly has been doing to provide enough gasoline to make the country work again. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Jesus, what do you make of the accusations that it's actually, when it comes to Venezuela, for example, or even Iran, there's been a lot of mismanagement within their oil industry and a lot of, corruption as well, and that over the years this has added up to the situation that we're seeing right now, that it can't just be blamed on the U.S. sanctions. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's crazy. There's corruption in the U.S., there's corruption in Afghanistan, in India, everywhere. That doesn't mean that Venezuela is going to blockade and forbid the U.S. people to have the gasoline or whatever they need. In our case, it's worse. Not in our case. At this moment, it's worse because we're in the fight, trying to fight a pandemic, trying to fight coronavirus. And these crazy people in the U.S. and the fanatics that support them thinks that this is great news. They are in their own crazy war in which they believe that they are doing the most wonderful thing ever. That's crazy. So it doesn't make any sense, especially at these moments where the world is fighting the pandemic.
All right, so Alec, I wanted to get your thoughts on that then, because how does it benefit the United States to continue the sanctions in the fashion that, for example, let's just talk specifically about Venezuela, where we know its oil industry is not doing well, its oil infrastructure is essentially at this point completely paused. Does that help it with its end goal of having Maduro leave? Doesn't that just create animosity actually towards the U.S.?
Well, you can trace this all back to the beginning of Chavez. So this has been, 20 years of animosity. Chavez, for instance, to talk about the mismanagement in PDVSA, got rid of a bunch of technocrats and put in a bunch of political people. So Venezuelan oil production has been dropping since about 2000. And so, ad hominem attacks are fine. This is the best way that the U.S. knows on how to try to modify the behavior of the Venezuelan government, who is targeting their own people, really. And so the U.S. goal, they're not affecting our economy. They're not affecting coronavirus in the United States. We're trying to do this. Remember, we're supporting the Lima Group, which is a Canadian and Latin American group dedicated to a political solution. And so we're trying to support a political solution in Venezuela. And honestly, Maduro is part of the problem and should leave. But really, it's the whole Chavista regime has dismantled Venezuelan society, and so we need new leadership in there. The Venezuelans need new leadership to get them out of the hole that they've dug themselves into.
All right, Jesus, a final word. Do you believe that these sorts of trade or, back and forth between the Iranians and the Venezuelans where they're helping each other, I imagine it's a give and take relationship. There's been talk about, the Venezuelans paying apparently, Iran in gold. All of that, of course, would need to be verified. But I mean, if all of that is true, do you think that that will continue? Do you think that the relations between these two, considering they have a common cause and considering they're both under U.S. pressure, that will continue?
Of course they will. Of course they will, and we will pay in gold, or we might pay it in diamonds, whatever, because we will pay in whatever way we find, trying to avoid U.S. sanctions. We are paying in gold because the U.S. and the European lackeys has been trying for the last 2 years, not has been trying, they have blocked, seized, and robbed our bank accounts all over the world. So how do they want us to pay? By telepathy or something? That's a stupid argument talking about the gold or whatever. They designed the sanctions, they blocked our accounts, our bank accounts that we traditionally use to pay for whatever we want to pay. And now they say that, that's too bad because we're paying in gold. Those guys are stupid. And that argument of thinking that they are doing something good for humanity, that's stupid also. I mean, those are just a bunch of right-wingers in the U.S. and around the world and in Latin America that are just trying a regime change, not only in Venezuela, but also in Iran, that have resisted for decades, and we will also resist for decades. We don't care. I mean, with gasoline or without gasoline, we are going to continue to be Chavista. Chavismo is not something, as the gringo says, that is only there because of the so-called military supporting Maduro. Chavismo is something bigger than that. And the problem in the U.S. and in the Western countries is that they don't understand that. They don't want to see it. But we are going to be there.
Okay, I believe there was a final word. We appreciate both Jesus and Alex for their time this morning. We've tried to give you viewers, as we always try to, both sides of the argument when it comes to any issue. And in Venezuela, of course, this is a very heated argument, as always, about the U.S. role, as well as, in this case, the Iranian role in Venezuela also, and the relationship between the Iranians and the Venezuelans at this time to try to support each other, as they both are under U.S. sanctions and U.S. pressure at this time. Will the U.S. be able to block any shipments of oil or whatever supplies they may be for the Venezuelans? Will the Venezuelans be able to continue to pay in gold or however to have the Iranians help them out? Will the refinery really be able to be up and running in any fashion at this point in time because of Iranian help? I mean, the Iranians are under a lot of pressure themselves as well. All of those questions, of course, remain unanswered, but nevertheless, the U.S. remains concerned at this point in time, and we'll have to wait and see if there will be a clash on the high seas, as both the Americans and the Iranians have just alluded to or implicitly spoken of at this time, as the U.S., mind you, surveys these tankers and ships very closely as they have left Iranian ports out for international waters. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Facebook and how it's being used by extremists, specifically in the U.S., who are preparing for civil war of sorts. Now, the Tech Transparency Project, back in late April 22nd approximately, had released a report about how a number of groups online were using different terms, or one specific term which the Facebook filters for violent language were not being able to trace, and that term is Boogaloo, if I'm saying it correctly. Around 125 Facebook groups use that term, and that's a term being used by far-right extremists specifically to describe the coming civil war. And now, just today, which is approximately a month after that report was released, I did a cursory search online, and a lot of those groups are still very much up and running. Those pages are still very much up and running and still very much seem to have those sorts of ideologies out there, propagated openly. So what is Facebook really doing in this regard? It says that it's shutting down this sort of talk. It's trying its best to filter all of this out online, but it doesn't seem to actually be happening for the large part, at least when it comes to these specific groups. They're being able to seemingly get away with a lot of the language that they've been espousing online. They're attracting many more members because of this entire COVID-19 pandemic and how they see that as a government conspiracy, et cetera, against them and possibly even their movement. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined up by Doctors Rashawn Ray and Matthew Hughey. Rashawn is a Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. And Matthew is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Connecticut. He's joining us now from Storrs in Connecticut. Matthew and Rashawn, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Matthew, let me start with you. What do you make of the fact that these groups are still very much up and running a month after this report even came out? Why or how is it possible that Facebook and other social media organizations are not taking this as seriously as they really should be?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm not surprised at all that these groups are still up and running and still are in fact growing. They're not the only ones to do so. I think there is a tendency, especially in the United States, but globally as well, to try to fit the supposed decline of overt white supremacy into this narrative of color blindness and post-racial kumbaya, love everyone, come together moment. But in fact, that is not true. And instead of thinking about racism as declining, we need to think about this particular form of racism that is violent white supremacy, white nationalism, and let's just call it what it is, white terrorism. It has moved location, and one of the places that it has moved location is online, right? And the use of code words, the use of phrases, the use of imagery that signals to in-group members has always been a long-standing, and I'm talking about over 100 years old, a use of symbols that speaks only to group members as a way of kind of disguising or dog whistle signaling to in-group members. And that's what we see here with Boogaloo in a kind of strange way. It's based off the film Electric Boogaloo 2, this 1980s film. And it references trying to create a second civil war, just as that movie was a sequel to the first, to try to recreate the Civil War. So I'm not surprised at all.
Rashawn, to use this argument, but I mean, and I know it angers a lot of people, but if this was a group or groups of people of color, be they African American or others, even Muslims possibly, and they were talking about the overthrow of the U.S. government, I would imagine that the response would be very different on the part of authorities.
Yeah, Waqar, you're exactly right. And again, thank you for having me on the show. I mean, what we've been seeing around the country, from Michigan to North Carolina, and it's interesting when we've seen a man walking across the street with a pipe wrench, and we see people across the street with assault weapons. What I always think about is, imagine if the weapon was on the other shoulder, meaning the shoulder as it goes from a white person to a black person. Immediately, all of a sudden, the reaction to it, the way that we apply laws completely changes. And so it's always interesting how one group of people are giving certain sorts of liberties and privileges to enact the First and Second Amendment, not just upon themselves, but also then restrict the movement, thoughts, and behaviors of other people as they move through public space. What we have to really realize is that white supremacist groups, right-wing groups, decided to take these moments, and of course there have been reports out about this and documents found, and of course the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States has spoiled a lot of terrorist acts, whether or not people were trying to blow up hospitals, people were trying to do things to testing centers. And so we see that the ways that these right-wing groups are mobilizing during this moment to try to recruit people. And what they realize is that for a lot of white Americans in the United States, they really link their identities of being American to white supremacy, and we have to be very realistic about that. So when they experience economic insecurity, when they experience anxiety, they pretty much fall back and rely on that those white supremacist notions that then help to make them feel superior.
All right, so what do you think the likes of Facebook and others should be doing? I mean, there is the argument to be made, okay, free speech, all of the above. How does one balance all of this out? I mean, this is clearly hate speech for, quite a lot of those posts that I've seen at least. But apart from the ones that are just hateful, the ones that are just talking about, I don't know, criticism of the government or otherwise, it's hard to find a balance, is it not? Or is it not? Am I looking at this in a very simple way?
I mean, this is a great question. I think your question kind of gets to the heart of what's going on here. And I think the first thing that we should collectively do is stop pretending that we don't know what this is and we don't know how to solve this. We know how to solve plenty of issues when we identify who we think is benefiting and who we think is harmed from it, right? There are decades and volumes of scholarship that address racial code words and language and how those words, images, and language hurts actual people. In this case, they're targeting the government, people of color, people they think that are on the left, et cetera, right? So we've identified that. I've been doing this work for over a decade. Dr. Ray has been doing this work over a decade. So when people don't address it, it's kind of a willful blindness and a form of apathy that lets you know how certain people stand and what certain people are allowed to get away with. Exactly to Dr. Ray's point, there is an incredible hypocrisy here with what white militias and white people in general are allowed to get away with, that if people of color do, they are demonized. Now, let's look at how much the First Amendment is actually restricted when it comes to copyright laws, when it comes to pornography, when it comes to film, when it comes to whether or not you can panhandle in public. Obscenity laws, slander, libel, inciting lawless action, all of these things are restricted under United States law. And yet somehow, in some way, these groups are given carte blanche to be able to behave in any way they want to. So one of the first things that we can do is actually bring to bear some of the laws that are meant to protect capital and certain forms of property, and use that to actually protect people, and especially people that have been historically marginalized in this country. And that's people of color, right? Yeah. The second thing is to engage in a more critical education on these issues so that people in the public can actually know what these words mean, know what's going on, and report them themselves. Because it's one thing for Facebook or a kind of state level authority to do it, and it's another when people themselves are saying, this is enough, this is a bridge too far, and we're not going to put up with rhetoric that would hurt my brother and my sister.
Rashawn, I've wondered this a lot of times. The fact that this is being let go, as in, this is being allowed to sort of fester online or even really on the ground. Do you think that the average, and I'm going to just pick on them for a moment, Caucasian even realizes that this could be a danger to them as well? Because, if there is, and I mean, in the worst case scenario, unlikely, hopefully, there is a civil war, as these groups would want, that would hurt everybody, wouldn't it? I mean, even the white population?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's similar to COVID-19, that there are narratives out that some sort of way it's only affecting certain groups, particularly Black Americans. And it really speaks to what Dr. Hughey was just saying about the normalization of whiteness. I really don't think that people realize the types of conversations that are had in people's households, particularly when people are in racially homogenous settings, whether they be white, Black, Latino, Middle Eastern, Asian, or otherwise. And so part of what that means is that normalization actually leads to people having a very high tolerance for racism, a very high tolerance for hate. And oftentimes what they assume is that if there is something that's going to happen from a racial standpoint, that their group is going to end up being superior and come out of this. And, there's a long history of this in the United States that speaks to people's perceptions that would be the case. So let's go back right after the Civil War. Right after the Civil War, the Confederacy lost. But then all of a sudden, after President Lincoln was assassinated, there were a series of actions put in place that actually emboldened the Confederacy, gave them their land back, help the leadership formally integrate into the U.S. government. And this is one of the reasons why we see the Confederate flag just going around like it is in the South, because people don't necessarily really interpret that the Confederacy lost in the way that it actually did. There were statues put up during the Civil Rights Movement that heralded the Confederacy in ways that people didn't necessarily interpret as being racist, even though it was. And then, of course, when it comes to gun laws and the ability to really enact the Second Amendment and even the First Amendment, when the Black Panther Party in the 1970s was marching and standing on government property in the state of California, Ronald Reagan, who was a pro-gun president, became an anti-gun governor in the 70s, where he actually restricted a lot of the laws when it comes to the ability for people in California to carry guns. So we see that the way that the law is applied differently, and we see that the way that a lot of white Americans realize and understand that if these laws are enacted, that they're going to be the ones who are given the benefit of the doubt.
Very interesting. I believe there's a final comment, but we do sincerely appreciate both Rashawn and Matthew for their time and, of course, their expert insight on this. We've only, of course, scratched the surface, as we always do, about this issue. There's a lot of factors within this which are important to discuss, but it's important to discuss this. It's very important for people to be aware, regardless of which side they sit on, but they need to be aware that the rest of us know exactly what's happening, and those who aren't aware need to be made aware of this issue, because it will, I mean, God forbid, in the worst case scenario, as I put to Rashawn, if this does come to pass as these groups want, this would be chaotic for everybody involved, all Americans, regardless of skin color. But yes, nevertheless, there are major double standards in how people of color versus those who are white are dealt with, and the freedoms that they are respectively given as different groups. We've already seen that when it comes to the protests surrounding COVID-19, and especially in Michigan, for example, we've had all those protesters carrying arms. I mean, how exactly does carrying arms help you gain your freedoms or prevent you from, respecting a lockdown? Are they going to be using their guns against politicians? I mean, what is the logic there exactly at this point in time, and why are they being allowed to then be so openly violent against elected officials in many regards? A lot of questions, of course, about how the U.S. and where the U.S. is heading when it comes to its issues with white supremacy. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.